Well, good morning everyone and welcome aboard. But today I'm going to be talking about sources for marriage in New South Wales, and I hope you enjoy the experience. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you some easy ways to get into the records and how to use our finding aids and everything, and draw it all together for you as much as I can. So we'll begin. Now, the first thing is you've got to be asking yourself, well, where do I start if I want to look for marriage records? And as so often is the case these days, you can start online. Now, there's no source that is of greater value when it comes to marriage records than the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages. You can see the link on the screen there now. They're the body that since 1856 have recorded the official documentation regarding marriage, and you can order certificates from the registry and also do family history research. The second source these days is now on Ancestry. They have a marriage index, 1788 to 1935, and they draw their records from different sources. And we have also now Find My Past, Australian Marriages 1788 to 1935. So you can do a lot of base research along these lines, and what I'm going to be doing today is showing you some techniques to make the most of your research and also to go a little bit deeper, which is what you always want to do when you do research. So we'll go to our webpage now, and what you can see there is one of the most important links in modern research with us, and that's our Research A to Z link. You can also see it's below the search box down the bottom, which is collection search, but I'm reaching for the one that's in the center of the screen. So I click, and this is the screen that you see when you go through to Research A to Z. Now, it's important in every topic that you want to research with State Archives. We've basically presented you how-to guides and also informational guides right there, and you can do an enormous amount of preparation before you even ask questions of our staff. I'd like to also mention that if you do of any sort of recap on today's webinar, or if anything is a little bit confusing for you, don't hesitate to come back here, because you can see a good overview of the marriage records, and I use this guide myself in terms of preparing. Now, if we drift down the page, we can see the one that is relevant for today is BDMs, Birth, Deaths, Marriages. And so that's the part of the page that is important for today, and also recapping today's work. I'm also going to start with the basics. So I'm going to go to the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and you can see a link right there. Now, the important thing to remember when you go to Births, Deaths and Marriages is they are not state archives. They're a body that is created in 1856 to be the official registrar of marriage and births and deaths, of course. And so they're the legal body that regard this part of our society. And so we don't supply marriage certificates here, and we don't have registrations of marriage, with a small exception that's coming up in a few slides. So just remember that you're dealing with a different body here. Many people make the mistake of thinking they're us. Now, the way to go is you hit that Start Searching button. It works very well. I'm obviously going to emphasize marriages for today's talk. And we go through to the marriage search button page. Now, I've always found I have better results here when I fill in all the relevant information. I'm only going to use my gentleman that I'm searching for, William Parr, at the top. Should be enough, but down the bottom I've put date of event from and to, and you get much better results if you can put dates from and to in. For example, how many William Parrs would there be if I searched 100 years of history? I imagine there'd be a few. So because I know my gentleman is from 1788, I know I'm going to get better results with that search the way it is now. And another thing to remember is always, if you don't get results, put in less information. So there's no need to put the second name or the third name unless you have a lot of people with the same name. You need to work out which one is yours. I'll just do a quick little look down the bottom. I've actually set the date 1788. So what I'm doing now for this demonstration is I'm going to find the first registered marriage in New South Wales. Number one, First Fleet. So here we go, let's launch. This is the results screen on the Births, Deaths and Marriages website. And as you can see, William Parr married Mary McCormick. And what I'm going to do now is show you how to use this effectively, and how to use this to have really powerful options here at State Archives. So we're going to zoom in, And what you can see now is that that code on the left is the volume number, and we can use that code to identify what to do with the record. And so I'm going to help you today to become an expert in that. Now, you see in the first part of the number, 1 to 1788, I think that means number 1 of 1788, the first ever recorded marriage. And down the bottom, you've got 3A, which means it's in volume 3A. Now, what happened, to explain what these numbers mean, is that when the registry was created in 1956, they actually had to legally bring all the marriages that were done by the Church of England and other churches together as an official record of all the legal marriages. So it's a very important thing. Now, when they brought those things together, they created a series of records and they numbered them in volume number. Now we have here on microfilm reel 1 to 123. So when I see that 3A, I know we have those records here on microfilm reel. So what I'm presenting to you now is that you don't have to buy that from the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages should you have any access to our reading room, because you can look for that for free in our reading room. And I'm going to show you an example now. So for those of you who'd like to save money in their family research, that's a very powerful option that's still on the table today. Now just remember, we have the microfilms in the reading room, and the arrangement is under legislation to release information. The marriage registrations are available to the public, but what they've requested is that we don't allow copying from our microfilm reels as part of the arrangement. So that means you can write it down, but you can't make a photocopy. Now it's clearly labelled in our reading room, and this is what you get through to in this case. It's the first ever marriage in New South Wales, William Parr to Mary McCormick, and you have a few others. The next 4 were on the same day, on the 10th of January 1788. Now I'll let you have some fun and look it up on Wikipedia when the first fleet actually landed and see how many days that was into the colony's history, but I can guarantee you some of those formed relationships on the hulks in England. Now remember, this is an example that I'm using for this webinar, but it's not something you can make a copy of in the reading room. You would have to write them down, the information. So you've got that option if you want to save money in your research. Now this is the actual listing of what we have in the reading room. On the right-hand side, we have the microfilm reels, clearly labelled copying not permitted. And on the left-hand side, a little bit of a breakdown, only to show you context. You don't need to know that. What you need to know is that we have the first 123 volumes. If your volume number is 123 or lower, we have that on reel, and that's an option for you. But what you can see is that the early ones are all Church of England, who was the only legal authority that could legally marry people in the colony at the beginning, and then eventually they broke it down into baptisms, marriages, burials, and eventually a supplementary listing and a few extra add-ons as well. Now, one of my research sayings in the reading room is that you haven't researched everything on marriages and births and deaths until you've used the Much Index. You know, it comes as a very, very powerful resource with a couple of limitations. Firstly, Thomas Davies Much was a gentleman who did a lot of research on the early births, deaths and marriages in the colony, and he drew together a series of different resources. He did his work at the State Library, and he created a series of cards in the State Library for the State Library patrons. And by the way, you can still use those cards today. Now out here at Western Sydney, we have reels 21 to 25 to 2129, which is just a copy on microfilm of the TD Much Index. Now, where it's useful for your research is that if any birth, death or marriage between 1787 and the 1830s, then this is the best resource to use outside of BDM's, the BDM website. So if you can't find someone on the Births, Deaths and Marriages website, try here. And also in this early period, that you can't get an absolute guarantee that everyone had a registered marriage or birth or death, because sometimes they just didn't go that way. Now with marriages, I'd like to think that you would think that it would be a marriage in a church, because otherwise there wouldn't be a legal marriage. But there's a lot of different sorts of unions at that time as well. So you don't always have a marriage. Keep that in mind. Now in this case, the TD Much Index is powerful up to 1830, and then from that time forward, it starts just researching set families. So it begins to be a little bit hit and miss for the average person's research. But when you're stuck, go to the TD Much, and if you get a nil result there, you have an outcome. So we're going back now onto the Research A to Z, and we're going back to our core search area, which is BDMs, and I've brought you through to our guides page. Now I'm going to try and train you a little bit in what to look for when you're using our website, because I want you to become a little bit like me in the sense that I understand where things are and it becomes a little bit of a home for you. Now on the top left-hand side, you can see there's the guides button is up, flag, the guides flag. That means we're looking at the guides on this subject. I notice when I look to the right of it, there's no indexes attached to this. So at the level of births, deaths and marriages, we don't have an online index at this time. Now, when we look down to the guides, the actual guide on this page, on the guides themselves, we're going to click on the first one. Notice again, we have a very good and in-depth historical overview. Now, I'm giving you a few highlights of the history, and essentially, at this stage, you need to know that at those dates, the different religions had the right, the legal authority to do legal marriages on those different dates. And so it did change over time, and it eventually evolves into approximately 30 to 35 different religious bodies could do a legal marriage, and also there was the ability to have a civil union and registry office as well. These all came in slowly over time, and each of these bodies would have to write to the colonial secretary and try and get given the right to give the marriages, and eventually they were granted the right. Now this page is good. If you're interested in the background of marriage records, have a read. It is extremely interesting. And marriage changes a lot with society, and a lot of this overview stuff is on this page. Now, I'm not going to go down the page for you this time because I think I'll let this be your homework, because if I was to go down to that sort of level, we'd be here all day. And I'm going to give you today the tools, and I'll let you fill in the gaps. Now, we're going to have a look at the second one, which is the Births, Deaths and Marriages Guide. So the first one is the registration of the marriage. The second one is going to be anything else. Now I've gone down to the marriages part, and you can see that there's a series of informational pages, and then below is going to be a list of all the types of records that you can access. Now, because I'm doing a webinar on what records you can access, I'm not going to go scroll down this page now, only because I think as long as you know it's there, and as long as if you have the interest, you can go back and have a look at it. Do it after the webinar, and you'll realize that I'm actually going to mention pretty much all of those records down the bottom there. So we move forward. Now, this is a picture of Government House in Parramatta, and I'm using it as a backdrop to a small history lesson so we can see where we were in 1806 in the colony. We had the Governor King was the governor of the day, and he found, and Samuel Marsden did some research in this area and came up with figures that of all the adult women in the colony, 28% were married, and the rest were living in de facto relationships. Samuel Marsden went further and actually called them prostitutes. Now, this means that there were large numbers of illegitimate children in the colony, and the governors saw this as a major problem and saw it as a problem for the society as a whole. By 1810, Governor Corrie was trying to fix this, and basically he was setting the rules for how marriages would be guided in the future. And he found in this proclamation of 1810 that persons of different sexes were cohabiting and living together unsanctioned by the legal ties of matrimony. So what this means for you and your research is that if you have an angle in your family that goes back to this pioneering time, you may actually be dealing with people who weren't married and who were living together. So this tradition goes back all the way at least to this time, and I'll probably much further as well. So always keep that in mind. Something that you may find in your research, you come through and you looked and there's no results. But what I would like to guide you with is that is actually a result, because you know that there's an absence of a record. You know then you have no proof that it happened, and you have to move forward with that information. So from this time, the rules that I'm about to show you evolved. So we're going to have a little history lesson here as well, but it's the last of the day, I promise you. We'll be looking at the records next. There's my representation of the people who would like to get married. And here are the rules under the Church of England. The first option was that you could get married by a special license. Now, the only person who could be married by special license had to be a free person, and they had to have £4 and 4 shillings for the privilege. So I imagine they had to be fairly well off. Now, in the United Kingdom, where all our laws were essentially moved over to the colony, the Bishop of England, of the whole of the UK, would have to be the person who grant the special license. And by granting that special license, they're saying, in a sense, that there's no obstacles to marriage. So, for example, example, they're not married to other people. They're not sister and brother. They're not stepsister and stepbrother, and so forth. There's no reason these two people should not get married. Now, a lot of these laws were born in the Middle Ages, and if you can turn your mind back to the Middle Ages, they didn't have the good record keeping that we have today, or even in the time of the convicts. And so therefore, proving that someone was not married to someone else would be impossible if the person had moved to the next village. So these sorts of things meant that that they could prove that it had been investigated that they were not married to someone else and there were no other impediments. And for everyone else, they had to use, who couldn't afford that £4 and 4 shillings and couldn't go to the top for recognition, they would have to do it by banns. Now, this is a tradition, again, that began in the Middle Ages, but if you can turn your mind to the Middle Ages world, this is actually a very powerful tool, because at 3 Sundays in a row, the clergy would announce that the couple would like to get married, and that gives it 3 weeks, perhaps even a month, for someone to come forward and say, no, 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 I'm married to the person on the left, or vice versa. So this is, in a sense, a way to guard society against any sort of wrongdoing in marriage, such as being married to 2 people, and also in terms of marrying someone who's in your family. Now, if you're a convict, your only option really is to go with the bans. Now, this is going to create records that you and I can look at. I'll show you what has to happen. They would have to apply to the Colonial Secretary. Now, that means we have those records, those applications, and touch wood in your case. And of course, if they're applying to the Colonial Secretary, you can get a yes and you can get a no. Refusals and acceptance. So refusals, that's generally speaking the end of the line. And acceptance will move through to the ban stage and get a marriage ban by clergy. And then that means that it was announced in church 3 weeks in a row. And then we can move forward to the ceremony. So that actually, I thought it was important to show you this little flow diagram, because I want to train you that we now know we can look for 3 different things. We can look for the application and then the result, that's one together, I guess. We can look for the bans and we can look for the special license. So I'm moving through now to show you those sorts of things. In our guides, this is just one part of our guide. So always go to our guide for where to start. It's the best way to recap what you're learning today on the webinar is in the guides. We have this Colonial Secretary Special Bundles Applications to Marry by Special License. Now, the reason it's under Colonial Secretary is that the Colonial Secretary was organising it. Remember, the Governor had to give permission for a special license. So in a sense, anything to go into the Governor goes to the Colonial Secretary, which means it goes straight into our archives. Applications to marry by special license. You'll notice that it's got a card index prepared by State Records, which is now a microfilm reel, but the reels are outlined down below. We're going to look at that one, 1830, for an example. So it's time to start showing you that if you're lucky enough to be looking for a special license, this is what you can find. And what you go through to is an application form, which I find interesting from a historical point of view, because even in 1830 and earlier, they were using forms, just like we do today. Times may change, but sometimes people don't. So I guess things stay more or less the same. Now you can notice there, we're looking at the marriage of Ellen Powright, and Richard Hilder is the officiating minister of church. Now this application would have had some sort of an affidavit with it. They have to essentially have a stat dec in the sense that they're not married to other people and all the other tests for marriage. Now this is the example for Ellen Plowright, because it turns out she's under 21. Now I'm going to show you on the second page some information regarding that, but on the front page you can see that she said under 21 years of age, free, in the centre there. Yeah, 3 lines of the right handwriting down, and then it moves on to the second page where also you can see a signature down the bottom, by the way, which is an interesting thing to be able to find. And then on the second, it's not the second page, it's actually further down an A4 page. What I've done is I've presented it on the screen so you can see it all nice and clearly on your screen. But you can see that permission has been granted. I, Thomas Cooper of George Street in the Colony of New South Wales Publican, do hereby certify that that the above name Ellen Plowright is under 21 years of age and I have given my consent to marriage to Benjamin Kirby. So this is the kind of information that you can draw forward should you be lucky enough to move into these records and find something. Now on this screen, I'm just giving you a sense of what you can do with our archives and finding things. And I've gone to collection search box at the top, and I've just put in marriage licenses. Now I'm doing this in my view my goal is to show you that if you have a search term that has an unusual term, such as marriage, there's not going to be 5 different types of marriages in the sense of 5 different things, and you're only looking for one of them. One marriage, any marriage records, you just put the word marriage in, it'll bring up any series in our collection that has the word marriage in it. Now in this case, I wrote marriage licenses because I wanted to draw forward this record, and it's showing you that it does work, and it works best when you have terms that are unusual and can't be misconstrued with something else. So marriage works really well for that. Now, butts of special marriage licenses, we're going to have a look at that series. Now we've gone through to the series description page, and what's really good about the series description page is you get a little box description of the records. In general, they're going to give you the background, why they were created, or what they have in common. And sometimes, and this is perhaps a good example of this one, it's going to show you how you can actually get into the records. So is there an index? Is there a, where are the boxes in the archive? What are their numbers? What reels do they cover? Is the records online? That kind of information. So I would like to, as my gift to you today, I would like to train you that you need to search these sorts of things from time to time. And once you get confident with it, you're going to have a lot of fun in your own research. Now, in this case, my eyes lit up when I saw the word index. So I had to put a red highlight on it, also available as PDF. It's we've created short guides over the years, and they're now being converted to an online source. This one's available, so I'm going to click on it now and show you what you can get. And bingo, straight index. Now remember, it's not a searchable database at the current time. You can't type in a name. It's old school. It's a printed page, but we can make these pages available to you over time, and this is a good example of how it's very useful. And also, because they're in alphabetical order, it's very quick to check. It's just as good as another database. Just another way of doing research for your family history that can be powerful for you. Now, if you look across the page, it gives all the basic information, which I don't need to explain, date of the license. But at the end, what I'm noticing, it gives a series number. The NRS number is what I term the key to the lock. If ever you do your research, always write down your NRS number, because no matter what happens, if you come to an archivist and show us an NRS number, we can tell you what it was. And you can do that yourself. Perhaps for another topic, another time, I will show you or someone else will show you, but it's very easy to do. We can show you in the reading room, and we can show you on the phone or even by email. But for the time being, I notice on the copy, it's got a COD number. That's a record that used to be very fashionable that we still have. It's called copy of document. It's a book. It's essentially a photocopy of the original record and in the reading room and available to you here. Now, this is just going to be a moment of eye candy for you, webinars people, to reward you for your attendance today. I'm going to show you the original record, and when general speaking, people are only ever going to access the reels. This is what the book looks like for the Church of Scotland marriage licenses that were issued. And I just wanted to show you because, hell, we're researchers, we want to have fun. And there you can see the actual book itself. What's interesting is that a lot of this convict era records have this format. They're essentially like a lottery ticket docket book. Have you ever used lottery tickets? You rip out a page, you give it to the person, and then you have a record left over of who you gave it to and what their number is. So many convict records follow that format. But if you look here, you can see on the right-hand side is the license itself, and on the left-hand side is a record of who got the license. Now, what's important, and I want you to notice, is that we don't, generally speaking, have records of marriage licenses to this level in the sense of the actual license given to the person, because they're always given to the person involved. And then, of course, the only way they're going to be found again is if for some reason they're confiscated, and in marriage, I don't think that's very likely, or it is somehow found its way into a museum. So they're extremely rare. They're extremely rare. You get to see one today. So we now switch over to the second form of marriage in this early period, marriage by banns. Now remember, you could be married by ban if you're free or a convict, and so this is important for both. But in this particular thing I have on screen now, it's the Principal Superintendent of Convicts Registers of Convicts Applications to Marry. What's good about the convict era and the convicts that you may want to research is that they would always keep records of convicts, and they would always check into the records. And I'm going to show you some proof of that in a few minutes. If you look down the page, you can see it's on COD and also on microfiche. It's alphabetical and by year. So it's a very simple process to research. And we also have the registers with an online index now, which makes it very useful for you wherever you are in the world. In this case, I'm going to scan down the page, just waiting for it to come up on your screens. And then you can see convict applications to marry has now got an online index. And so remember, this is for the applications. We go into the index. I'm choosing to search for Smith because I have no imagination today. And we go through to the results page. Now on the results page, it's all results page give you a world of information. And so going forward from there is when I try and give people advice, I like to say, what's your goal today? Do you want information, or would you like to have an idea of what the actual records looked at? I'm a historian. It's a very simple thing for me. I'd always want to see the record of myself. But if you're informationally driven and you just want the details, you get an enormous amount of details right now, right here. So right across the page, you can see who the applicants were, the female and the male. You can see the ships they came on. So that means you can be confirmed it's your female, not someone with the same name. You find their age, you find their sentence, and you find whether they were bonded or free or born in colony in some cases and not even a convict. Although we're in the convict applications to marry now, excuse me, I just lost my flow. You've got the date of the permission. You've got the clergyman. Notice there's Samuel Marsden as the first one. He's a known identity in Australian history. And on the right-hand side, well, I'll go to the right-hand side first because I've started to talk. We have the actual information on the citation. And remember, the NRS number, that's really important because that tells you you've checked convicts' applications to marry. And if for any reason you stop research and you start again in 10 years, you could ring me up or one of my colleagues and say, look, I looked at NRS 12212, what was that? And in a moment we can tell you. And if you learn a few simple tricks, you can do that yourself. It's quite simple. It's not difficult. And you can even, if you then write down the rest of that information there, you can actually tell where you got this information from. Back on the first part of the screen, you've got a box. Now for all of the international researchers or the interstate or the long distance researchers, this is a record you can order remotely. And so always look on the left-hand side for a box. We will be adding to these kinds of options for you in the future over time. And at the moment you can order this one. So you click on that box, you go to the bottom of the screen, proceed to checkout, and then you follow the instructions. Now, obviously, you want to see one of these, and I think that's a very reasonable thing. So I've gone through to the results page. This is an example. I just chose at random, and you'll notice that the left-hand page and the right-hand page are pretty identical, just different people. And so you get the basic information. This is the permissions on this page. So these are the people who had their applications granted, so you know they got married. And again, the same sorts of information, the age, born in colony there, and the ship they came on, their sentence, and so forth. Name, the ship they came on, the sentence, bonded or free, date of permission, and also the clergyman. Now, the clergyman is going to come in handy. There are other sorts of records that I can show you in a few minutes. So once you get through to this kind of information, it is actually very useful because the clergy kept records too, and they can actually be very illuminating for the whole process of marriage. Notice the gentleman, the reverend there is crossed. That's how they used to write their S's. Now this is the refusals. I personally find the refusals fascinating because it tells me so much about the way they thought in those days. But we'll go with the basics first. There's a name and the ship, so that way you can be sure it's your person. You've got an age as well. You've got the sentence. You've got the date of the refusal, and you've got the reason. Now, I'm going to go through just a couple of examples on reasons, but you can be refused for all sorts of reasons. And what I did some research for this on the exhibitions, and what I noticed when I looked through lots of refusals is I saw lots of evidence that they didn't just take the convict's word for things, they would check. So if you gave your name, they made sure it really was your name. If you gave a ship, they made sure it really was your ship. If you said that you were previously married, they would then look into that and so forth. So this is just one example to show you what I mean. A little bit hard to read on the screen, but I've transcribed it for you. It says Martha Pickard stated on her arrival that she was married and had 3 children. So that means she cannot legally get married again, so she was refused. There'd have to be some sort of evidence that her partner was dead for that to be overturned, and without the evidence and the trip back to England being approximately in 6 to 9 months, it it would be an unusual case if they would then have be able to get married after that sort of thing. But what it tells me when I was reading lots of these refusals is that they actually gave very honest answers when they got off the ships, because they would have just been asked the question, do you have a wife? Do you have family? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And when they go for a marriage to another person, their refusals for that reason. And so what that tells me is that it is true, what we've heard, is that they obviously thought they were getting a divorce when they left the UK, because they were never going to go back. They were never going to see their family again. So they assumed they could marry again in the colony. And they assumed incorrectly, which you can see from these records, because they would get refusals quite routinely for this reason. And if you look at lots of them, it happens all the time, several times on this page. The next one down shows evidence that they used to check the details as carefully as they could, and I think quite well. In this case, Walsh's ship being erroneously stated. I actually feel a little bit sorry for people who may erroneously state something, because I wonder if it's a memory issue. I don't know. I do see evidence in these sorts of records of fraudulent behaviour. Who knows? I'll leave that for your family history to make those judgments. But in this case, I can see, as I look left, he's given himself as free, and he gave the ship as Castle Forbes. So either it was fraudulent or it was a mistake. We'll never know. Now, the next item on the page is we're now moving through to the marriage bans, and this is the one example I'm going to be using is from the same record series, Registers of Conflict Applications to Marry, and I'm going to highlight down the bottom, just sliding down the screen. I'll wait for it to come up on your screens. John Hills and Anne Moody. So what we have here now, we have a 29-year-old and a 27-year-old getting married, and the Reverend Dickinson marrying them from the field of Mars, marrying them together. One is free and one is on bond. And now we move through to the actual marriage ban record. Now remember, the ban was an audio, a verbal ban in the church, essentially saying, does anyone know if these two should not get married? But the record was kept that we have of convict marriage bans, and hopefully in the case of your family history, you can come through to a record like this in the end. And what you see across the page, Anne has the wonderful term of spinster next to her name, which means that she's unmarried. And I think Charles Dickens is responsible for that term feeling a little negative. And we move through the ship that they arrived on, the years, whether free or bond, the service was conducted, and remarks down the end. And notice in the remarks it gives native place and so forth. In this case, has the consent of the master. So that's interesting, because they would have to get permission. And in looking at permissions, I have seen permissions from the master of the female factory and so forth. So you can get a little bit of the texture into the story that you're researching from these kinds of records. And it takes a little bit of digging, but the outcomes and the results can also be good. We go back to the guide. And what I'm highlighting here now is returns of persons whose marriage have been authorised by the governor following the publication of bans. So we're now moving away from the religious records more into the government records, which, they're all the same in terms of your research. And you can look down the right there, it gives you the container in the box and gives the item on the reel that it's on. So currently these records are only microfilm reel. And it brings you through to these records, parish records. And this is an example of a record that you can find, not from the previous series, excuse me. This is a record that is actually, I think, underutilised in our collection, because under Colonial Secretary and underneath the clergyman's name, you can actually find documentation, like a bundle of information about the whole process, the application, the ban, the information going from the clergyman that he thinks there's no impediment for them to get married. And it's something that you can only find should you know to look. So that's my gift to you today for being at the webinar. This is information for a series that is underutilized, is available, and with a little bit of luck and a little bit of optimistic digging, you can have a wonderful outcome. They're in Colonial Secretary's papers. They'll be in the guides that you can go through and find the area, but essentially they're under the name of the clergyman. So should you want to do research here at the archive, you can come in and we can show you how to look, and well, then you're on your own, because I can never guarantee an outcome until someone looks in the box. But I have seen these records. We have a large string of clergy records, and when you go into each file, it is like a little bundle of treasure, a treasure trove of information. Everything you've seen today and perhaps a little bit more. Now, this is a trick I want to teach you. It's useful for my topic today, but I actually just want to teach you that you can do this too. I'm going to look for information on the Colonial Secretary on the screen for you now. And what I'm going to do is do it in a way that's a little sophisticated. I'm going to search Colonial Secretary, and rather than just search the website, search the collection, which is what everyone is doing when they do a search, I'm actually going to search the website. Now, this means any mention of Colonial Secretary in all of our guides and all of our information pages will be listed for you. Now, Colonial Secretary actually has a long page, but you can see from the very beginning of it that it has a large number of, two very good informational packages. I personally like historical backgrounds, but I have a mind that's very historical. I like to know the context of what I'm looking at. And it's something, one of the pleasures of my job is I get to look into the history of things routinely all the time. But for you, it's an option, it's your hobby, and you can decide what your angle of interest is. On the right-hand side, you've got links. You can filter it out to just different sorts of things. Until you know what you're doing, I wouldn't recommend using that. Wait until it's useful to you for your research. Now, if we go further down the page, we get to some of the most interesting records in the collection, and they get used, but I just want to make sure that everyone realizes they're there. They're called special bundles. Now, special bundles under Colonial Secretary tells you a lot about how they thought. Now, what they used to do, and it changed over time, but what I'm saying is a general truth, is that anything that comes in on the same subject, they would keep it together. And they would eventually call these sorts of things bundles. Now, previously I mentioned the clergy records. They were actually bundles under the clergyman's name and kept by the Colonial Secretary. These ones, which I'm recommending now, they actually must have thought something very special about them, because they call them special bundles. Now, if you're a historian and your angle is history, these are one of the best resources you can look through. And whenever I'm helping a historian in the reading room, appropriate to the time frame, I always show them special bundles. In your research on marriage, marriage is considered a special bundle. So you can have a look in there and find extra things. Now, on this page that I chose, and just looking down the page for marriage, you can see there's all these different records that are available for research. Now, if you're a historian, I see a few there that might be interesting for you if you're looking at the overview. And also there are angles, because today's webinar is designed for people finding marriage records. I haven't catered it to the historian in general. There are going to be statistical records in our collection as well, but I'll leave that for you to talk to archivists about and draw that forward. In case here, we see a number of records under special bundles, and a number of the records that you will find in the guides are actually in the special bundles as well. So really, I'm just letting you know this exists. It's another pathway into our records. And if you look at the other topics just up and down the page there, you can see that it goes quite wide. I mean, there's an inquiry into Port Macquarie, probably right, I don't know. You've got a female factory down the bottom, returns of punishments, sounds very interesting. You've got Newcastle coal supplies, tenders for government contracts, and so on. It's very wide ranging. Oh, conflict sensitive Van Diemen's Land per the kangaroo in 1816. So if you're a historian, I think it's a treasure trove. If you're a family historian on the subject of marriage, they're still very useful. Now, this is an example where you can find records on marriages in places where you wouldn't otherwise have thought they would be. Like, for example, they're not listed under marriage. And I think this is a really good example of one that you can find in an odd place. Now, it's actually from the Probate Papers of John Emery. And why I thought this was an interesting thing to showcase today is never, ever, ever leave your research with just the obvious sources. Now, you're in control of your research, but my advice to you is if you have the persistence to go a little bit further into the story, look for the probate, look for the inquest, look for these other records that exist as well. You can sometimes get a reward such as this on the page today. Now, it's actually a handwritten note from the Reverend Samuel Marsden, known as the flogging parson, and it gives you, it's like, I imagine it's like a stat deck. It's saying this person was married, and so in essence, he's giving the right to the female in this marriage, that she has the right to the proceeds of this probate. So this is actually pretty important stuff. And so I imagine that they don't just assume they were married, and particularly when at one time there was 72% at this time too. 72% of people weren't married. This person has gone to court to prove that she was married, and the parson involved wrote this to prove it. And he says the above is a true copy of the register. So, you know, the years may change, but the times stay the same. It's amazing how similar the past is to what we do today. So from 1856, the state had a responsibility following English law, very similar in terms of they transferred the laws to the colony. Each state had to keep a legal register of marriages, and that's why when I started this presentation, I said go to the marriage registrations. Now this is where you go, and I'm going to use it a few times now as we go through this modern era after 1856, because I'm just going to show you that it's actually quite simple, and if you get skillful with it, it can lead to other things. So we go back to the Births, Deaths and Marriages website. We go to Family History Research. Now what you'll notice on this page, and this time I'm going to show you, is that it gives you access periods on the records. Now, something that I know as an archivist, and I'm sharing with you in this webinar, is that everything in terms of records has access periods and conditions. So that means some records are closed because they're too new, or some records are closed because they're too private, or in some way they might harm the society. There's all sorts of reasons. Now in this case, births are closed for 100 years. Notice that would be the lifespan of the ordinary person living a long life. And so they think just about everyone won't make it that far. Deaths over 30 years ago, that's a very short term because they're dead, there's no privacy issues. And marriages is set to 50 years. So those are the conditions for it to be under family history. Now, if you want a marriage in the last 50 years, you would go a different direction. You go into marriage and relationships, and you would then go into the process of making an application for a marriage certificate, and it would cost money as well. And you would have to provide information proving that you're doing it for family history reasons. So there's a little indicator that they think, just like we do here at State Archives, that there are laws that we have to abide in terms of protecting privacy and also protecting government information, but the records are still available for family history, so you can work through the system. So I go straight in, yeah, usual thing. I'm now going to search for Doris Frances Glover, and her marriage was between 1924 and 26. Remember I said one of the little tricks, it's best to have a from to date, you'll get better results. It also filters out the non-people who aren't the right people. And also, if it turns out that there's no Frances, I would take that off and just look for Doris Glover. But there is in this case, because I've prepared it before. I'll notice that it's Doris F, so that's transferred well through. I just noticed that now. Now this is her marriage certificate. You can order it on the left-hand side. And I prepared this before. This is her marriage certificate. As you can see, it's a sample from the Births, Deaths and Marriages. And it gives you an indication of what you can get if you look for an actual certificate in this modern era. Still using the term spinster. I noticed in 1924, charming term. I noticed the gentleman's from Kentucky, and I noticed that they were married in the police station. So it's actually, oh, and also you've got the parents' names and so forth, and where they're from and what they did. So these sorts of records, from the point of view of family history, are the skeleton of the records. I always, when I'm giving advice to people in the reading room, I say you always start with Births, Deaths and Marriages, because it gives you so much information that you can then use to find records in our collection. So you've got occupations and so forth. These can all lead to questions that you can ask the archivists. And so the more you have when you start your research with us, the more you can have later on. So we go back to the main page, Family History Research. We're going to do one more, just rolling through. Yeah, you know where I'm going. And this time I'm looking for Kevin McNamara. And his marriage was between 51 and 53. Now, it turns out that's his marriage certificate. Sorry for the green color, but I can't change the original records. I'll just bring it in a little bit closer to your screen, and you can see that we have a lot of interesting records and a lot of interesting information, excuse me. And for example, the addresses that they're in, and where their parents' names and occupations, all the same sort of thing that you saw on the previous screen. And now we go through, it turns out I have a photograph of the happy couple. Now, what's interesting in this case is that I don't want to misrepresent this. We do not have a series called Marriages in New South Wales Photographs / photographs. There's no such thing. There's no such requirement to keep those sorts of records. They're actually personal records, but they do come into our collection in interesting places. And one of those places is when there's a divorce. Because what they would have to do in a divorce proceedings is they had to do several things. Firstly, they had to prove that they were married. So in this case, they presented their marriage certificate and they presented the photograph saying they actually got married as well. And then they had to prove that someone was at fault. Now, in this era, the era of our records that we have on divorce, you don't get a divorce unless someone's at fault. There's a reason. It's changed in modern times. I'm sure you're more aware of that than I don't need to explain. So we're going to look for this divorce. And if you do it in our main search box under collection search, and you write Margaret Emily McNamara divorce, or the gentleman's name, the word divorce is the key here, because it's going to filter out all the probates, it's going to filter out all the records that have that name attached in terms of government records, like a minister or something else. It's just going to get us the divorce records. Now, I have prepared this before because it goes through to one a hit. And if you look down the bottom, you can see the item is, you'll see an item number followed by the name. Now, the natural instinct of humanity is just say, oh, I got something, I'm good to go. What I want to teach you today is to go one step further. You click on that thing and you go through to what we call the item page. Now, this is the page that is most useful to you. And that's why I'm teaching you always click on the item. In terms of our website, always click on the item. And what you've got, as you can see, the divorce began in 52, finalized by 54. It doesn't have any follow-on records. In this case, it was one set of divorce. And you can see an item number. And at the top, this is the bit that matters for your research. If you're remote, you can order a copy. If you can get to our archive and you want to have a look at the original, you can pre-order. So copy service, you follow the instructions, and pre-order, essentially you're filling in the information with your details. Now, I'm not going to go very far into this divorce because we do have another webinar on divorce, but I thought it was relevant in this talk today because I'm actually showing you that you can get information about the marriage from the divorce files. It sounds so ironic to say that out loud, but you can. In this case, we've got a photograph of the couple, and now we have a reason they got divorced. So on that page there, you can see that the petitioner was married. Yes, we know that. We've seen the evidence. The respondent has to prove that she has just cause or excuse willfully deserted the petitioner and without any just cause or excuse left her continuously so deserted for 3 years and upwards. So it turns out he went back to Victoria and the divorce went through as per you can see. So there's another webinar on divorce if you want to go there and have a look at divorce in detail. There's a whole world of information that they can provide there. But the gist of it for us is that yes, they had to prove their marriage was in divorce, and for that reason, we will find records of marriage in the divorce files. As ironic as that sounds. So for more information, always remember research A to Z. There's 2 places you can click it. I find the one that's under quick links is the quickest one to find. You go through to the page. All these pages are valuable to you. I'm scrolling down the page, so I have to wait for it to come up on your screen. And as you can see, you always start with the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages. The BDM side is also valuable to you. Yep. And then you go through to the guides. And this is a really good way if you want to recap anything today, because my goal of the webinar is to give you the confidence that you can do it yourself, because you can go a long way just using our guides. And I always encourage you, ring an archivist. We have phone numbers that you can contact us. And that's a really good way to get through to an expert who can give you a little bit of a context We're here and we love helping people in that sort of a way with information, and we have always going to have more information for you. In fact, I learn something new every day in my job, so you have the benefit of that experience. And a webinar is really going to be really good at setting you up, but there's always going to be another level up you can go on your own, or with a bit of effort, or talking to other researchers. Now, we're winding down the webinar now, and you can notice that we have an exhibition coming up on this subject of marriage, love and law. It's going to take a look at marriage from the society point of view, not the individual. So it's going to look at how things changed over time. Women eventually got rights in terms of owning land and inheriting land from their husbands, and different changes in the laws for how old you had to be to get married and so forth, and the registrations and so forth. It's going to look at it quite deeply. It's going to be fascinating, and it's going to be available in areas all around the state. And for that, I'm going to tease you today, because I'm not going to tell you any more than one location, which is going to be the Penrith Regional Gallery from 30th of March to 15th of June. But if you want to stay tuned, as it says on screen, go to our events page, and it will describe where things are being held. Which brings me to the close of our talk today. And I hope you had a good time. I hope you enjoyed the experience, and I hope you learned something. I hope that, even off topic, you know, for the sections that you would like to know more about, the sections that aren't relating to your research, it could be quite interesting to know. That's how the records are organised. And always know that we're giving you the guide to get you going, but you know, your research is your ownership, and we can here to assist you at any level, and your level will rise the more effort you put in. So if anything from today's webinar confused you, go to the guides. If anything in the guides is not something you understand, or you want a little bit more information, feel free to talk to us on the phone and we can take you further. So in concluding my talk, thank you for coming today. I enjoyed presenting it to you. I hope you enjoyed the information I was able to show you, and good luck in your research.